All right, well, what are you looking at? Oh no, do I have to do a math? This is basic math. Now, sometimes people just like to wing it, and after you've been weaving for a while, you can start to do a lot of calculations in your head. And once you're familiar with the yarn you're using, you can pretty much figure things out. It is a good idea to start with some kind of a calculation sheet. There are many on the computer. You can find different places. This was one that I picked. There were some that were more complicated, some that had less information. And when I'm actually doing a project, now what I often do is, I'm just going to show you what I've done, is I take a piece of paper and I do my calculations. Now, one of the things that this one doesn't have on it, it doesn't really talk about the kind of yarn that we're using. So you might want to do something like this to get started. This basically is a little very rough diagram. It's telling me how much yarn I'm using. And now I decided that the cotton, I see here I have 1,100 yards per pound. I'm going to change that to 12. So that's the kind of yarn I'm using. And the weave structure is a plain weave or a tabby weave. And the loom I'm using is a 4-shaft loom. Now, some of the calculations that I'm doing today could also be used for a rigid head loom. However, what I'm going to be doing is going on to the next step, which will be measuring the warp once I figure out how long it's going to be and how many ends I need. And then I'm going to be today warping or not today, but in the next lesson after the warping board, we'll be warping a 4-shaft loom. So in this situation, I just want to make note of that. So now you see there's all sorts of things. I'm going to zero in on the top part here. So we're going to look at this part first. And that might be all that we'll talk about today. I think that's all we're going to talk about in this particular session or section. So we have the first line that says the finished length of the total piece. Well, how long do I want it in inches? In my diagram, I put down 2 yards, and if we remember from way back when, 1 yard has 36 inches, so 2 yards are 72. So I'm going to put 72 in here. And then it says fringe or hems. Well, in this situation, there's going to be fringe. And I like to have a nice long fringe, enough that I can tie a knot on it. So I'm going to add 12 inches for the fringe. That's 6 inches for both sides. And now it tells me that there's going to be some shrinkage. Shrinkage can be anywhere from 10 to 20%. So if I'm going to have something that's about 72 inches, 10% would be 7.2, but I'm going to go up a little bit more. I'm going to go in between the 10 and the 20. So I'm going to say, it sounds pretty wild, but I'm going to put 10 inches down. And now the last part says loom waist. In this situation, I'm going to be using the loom waist as part of my fringe. So in many ways, I'm not going to have any loom waist in this particular project, because anything that I tied on the one end and the other end is going to be untied and used for my fringe. That's one nice thing when you're doing a scarf and you're going to use the fringe. So in this situation, I'm going to leave it at that. So it tells me to add them up. And if I add everything up, we have 94 inches. Well, what is 94 inches if we were going to divide it by 36? And also, if you happen to be using the metric, some of these particular devices also have the metric on them. So in this case, we would get our calculator out, and I'm going to use the old-fashioned calculator. I don't have my phone with me right now. So we're going to take that. We're going to take 94 and divide it by 36. And I get 2.6. Well, that's about 2.5. So I'm going to say 2 1/2 yards. That's how long my warp needs to be. So that's the first part. Now the second part has to do with the width. How wide do I want it? So it says here, and we also have the about reads here, but let's just focus on finish width needed. I would like my scarf to be 8 inches wide. And they're again telling me 5 to 10% shrinkage. Okay, well, I'm going to add about an inch. And shrinkage, again, I'm going to add another inch. My experience with yarn, it can be that much. And I've always wanted, my scarf could be a little bit wider. This doesn't have to be an exact. So that would be 10 inches. And as I said earlier, I'm going to do this at 8 ends per inch. So we have an 8. And I know I'm going to need a total of 80 ends for this project when I'm making my warp. Now this also, we do some calculation here to determine to make sure I have enough yards and enough yards for the project I'm doing. So they're telling me to take this one and multiply it by that. So let's do that in a calculator. We're going to have 2.5 times 8 times 80. And I get 200 yards. That's how many yards it's telling me that I'm going to need to do this project. So earlier, if you recall, I did some weighing of, I didn't do weighing, but I did some calculation, found out that the two balls of yarn that I have approximately are 1,200 yards per pound, but I didn't weigh these. So while I'm talking here, I'm going to go over to the scale and I'm going to weigh and see how much I have. It's telling me that I have 6 ounces. Well, that's good news. Sounds pretty good so far to me. So if I have 6 ounces, and again, we have the 1,200, we know there's 16 ounces in a pound. There's 75 yards per ounce. So we're going to take that 75 times 6. And according to the calculations, I have 450 yards in these two, and it says I only need 200. So that's the good news. The good news is if I wanted to, perhaps I could do 2 scarves at one time. So we'll see. So again, the next segment, what we'll be doing. All right, we already know how much yarn we need for the warp, but how do we determine if we have enough for the weft? So now we're going to take a look at the bottom part of the sheet. And first of all, they want me to write in the total width of the warp. In the loom, it'll be 10 inches. Take up 5 to 10%. So let's add an inch. And we get 11. And now it says picks per inch. I often think that picks per inch are about 2/3 the number of warps ends per inch. So if I'm weaving and it's 8 ends per inch, we're going to say 6. Okay. So we have 11 inches times 6, which would be 66. And now the total length of the warp in inches, 94. So again, we'll use our handy dandy calculator here, and we'll multiply 66 times 94. Okay, so we have 66 times 94. We get this big number, But remember, this is inches to 6,204 inches, but we have to divide that by 36. And it comes up to 172 yards. And when I think about when I'm weaving something, I already said it's about 2/3. So if I need 200 yards for my warp, I'm going to need a little less for the weft because you're not weaving all of the fabric, all the yarn. You're going to have some for fringe in this case. So that's what I have to make sure. And again, with the yarn that I was using, if I wanted to, I could probably, I have almost enough because this is about 500 yards or close to that. So if I added those two together, I would have enough here to make a scarf. So that's what we need to do to make sure you have enough yarn to finish your project.